Today at the National Press Club, Dr Katherine Woodthorpe, one of Australia's most influential people in innovation. Dr Woodthorpe is a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and the Academy of Technology and Engineering. Today she'll deliver the annual Ralph Slatyer Address on Science and Society at the National Press Club.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Mark Kenny, Vice President of the club, and we are delighted to be back in person for the first time in many long weeks. With a degree of caution, I might add. Can I begin by acknowledging the original custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Our speaker today is Dr Katherine Woodthorpe, who has been described as one of Australia's most influential people in innovation. She will deliver the 2021 Ralph Slatyer Address on Science and Society. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr Katherine Woodthorpe.
Oh, that's better. Thank you, Mark, and everybody here. Thank you so much for having me. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on Ngunnawal country today, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge all First Nations people who might be in the audience around this beautiful country of ours, and especially to all those deadly scientists out there, teaching us aspects of science in astronomy and the environment, whilst caring for this country as they have for millennia. And a special shout out and congrats to Corey Tutt and his Deadly Science program that won a Eureka Prize earlier this month. I'd like to acknowledge a number of guests that we have in the audience today. Most importantly, Mrs. Slatyer and Ralph's daughters Beth and Judy and son Tony. As you know, this oration is named the Slatyer Address, and I think it's important to share a bit about this special man. Recent chief scientists are moderately known. They speak on radio, appear on television and in print, and a number of the general public would know their names. I suspect that wasn't the case for Ralph Slatyer. In the 80s, the reach of our chief scientist into the public sphere was far more limited, but he and the subsequent chief scientists through to today played and continue to play a vital role. Dr. Slatyer's love of being in nature led him to a career as an ecologist, leading him then further into CSIRO and then to ANU. And in 1977, Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser offered the position of Australia's ambassador to UNESCO to Dr. Slatyer. He then appointed him as chair of the Australian Science and Technology Council. This part-time position was essentially the Prime Minister's science advisor. When Bob Hawke came to power, he agreed for Ralph to stay on. He wanted an advisor on tap in a full-time position and to establish a Prime Minister's Science Council and Coordination Committee on Science and Technology. And sometime after that, Ralph accepted the job of the newly created position of Australia's Chief Scientist, a role Dr. Cathy Foley has recently taken over. The Chief Scientist provides independent scientific advice to the Prime Minister and other senior ministers. They champion Australian science internationally and promote an understanding of science among Australians. One of Dr. Slatyer's key program initiatives was the Cooperative Research Centres Program. In a modern context where science policy has been somewhat labile and programs have come and gone, one of the great strengths of the CRC program has been its longevity and relative stability. When one is trying to get organisations, especially commercial ones, to sign on to a contract for 7 to 10 years, that stability works to reassure them of the strength and value of the programme. And so the first of many rounds of CRCs was announced by Prime Minister Bob Hawke in 1991. As he said in his launch of the March 1990 election, in this national task of mobilising our human resources, our scientists and researchers stand at the forefront. Australia must reduce its reliance on imported technology and borrowed research. We must become a leader in the production and export of ideas. But where do I fit in? And why am I so interested in this program? Well, I've been involved for about 26 of those 30 years that the program's been going. Initially, I was a member of the expert assessment panels, and soon after I became the visitor, or an official advisor, to the Satellite Systems CRC. In 2001, we put Australia's first homegrown satellite, about the size of a bar fridge, called FedSat, into space. After 6 years of helping to assess which CRCs should be funded, I then jumped over to the other side of the table and started to help CRCs. I was appointed to take over the role of chair at the first of that first batch of CRCs that had been announced, the Antarctic and Southern Ocean CRC as it was originally, and at the point where I became chair, it morphed into ACE, the CRC for Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems. I think I was the first female chair in the CRC program. After I became chair to ACE, then I was appointed to chair SmartPrint and later Bushfire and Natural Hazards and Hearing CRCs. In addition, over the years, I've been involved with Microtechnology, Interaction Design, a Director of Environmental Biotechnology, Deep Exploration Technologies, Sustainable Tourism, Capital Markets and Reliable, Affordable Clean Energy. So you could say I'm a bit of a CRC junkie, but I still haven't really answered my own question. Why do I love this program? As somebody who's come from a PhD in science into the business of science through commercial roles, I've always been passionate about research that delivers impact. And the CRC program is premised on that. Whether the centres have been very commercially focused or totally researching issues in the public good, they've all had to demonstrate how they will deliver impact in their sector. The combination of user-driven research programs and embedded translation programs have led to substantial benefits to Australia, its people, and indeed the world. To quote a colleague, the research in CRCs need to be user-driven, useful, usable, and then, most importantly, used. And all of this tells us that the CRC program is designed to deliver to the Australian public outcomes that benefit them both directly in, for instance, improved healthcare and the environment, indirectly in new jobs, in new industries like aerospace and manufacturing such as advanced materials, whilst also training a huge cohort of the next generation of scientists in user-driven research, another issue about which Dr. Slatyer was passionate. But to return to the theme of how science delivers to society, I think the CRC program provides a clear example of how investment in science delivers benefits to the broader community. And I'd like to take you on a journey through some of the CRCs that I've been involved with to highlight a few of the great outcomes that they've delivered. As I mentioned earlier, I've chaired both the CRC for Bushfire and Natural Hazards Research and Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems, so I am officially the Queen of Fire and Ice. Both of these CRCs have been pure public good research centres. That doesn't mean they don't deliver an economic benefit, quite the opposite, just not a commercial benefit. For example, the Antarctic CRC did a lot of valuable work on the modelling of sea level rise to be used by, amongst others, coastal local government areas to determine how their future planning needs to take sea level into account and how to manage major infrastructure assets that are near the coast, like ports and airports. It's not just about the absolute level of the ocean, but more importantly, the increased frequency and ferocity of storms consequent from sea level rise and ocean warming. For example, work with the large airport enabled them to determine how much height they needed to add to their sea level runway and apron in order to account for increasing sea level and storm surges. At about $1 million per centimetre of height raised, they didn't want to add more than they needed, but also nor risk adding too little. Our work helped them to optimise their mitigation approach. Australia's leading role in Antarctic and Southern Ocean science today is, in large measure, a result of that original commitment and shared scientific vision of the CRC partners since its inception over its 28-year life. It was announced just after the Madrid Protocol. Driven by Bob Hawke and the Australian government, banning mining in Antarctica was signed. In turn, the currency of influence in Antarctic and Southern Ocean affairs is based on the level and calibre of research carried out by Antarctic Treaty countries. ACE's contribution to this was substantial. From understanding the role of Southern Ocean and Antarctica in the global climate engine, to understanding how changes in the ocean affect our fisheries, to modelling the future climate of our varied wine-growing regions, the work of the CRC has delivered a huge economic benefit to Australia. And the Antarctic Science Foundation, which I now chair, is dedicated to raising funds to augment and support our ongoing Antarctic research program. And so moving from ice to fire, as you do, the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC has led to economic benefits, of course. Most importantly, it's saved lives. Through improved extreme fire behaviour modelling to targeted messaging for communities across all hazards, the CRC has worked across the whole of Australia, improving the management of and recovery from the major natural hazards that beset this country. Its valuable work has been recognised, and an ongoing 10-year funding commitment to natural hazard research has been made by the Commonwealth Government, and we thank them. The Hearing CRC, on the other hand, combined both public good benefits and clear commercial outcomes. The partners, such as Cochlear, worked with the CRC to develop those commercial benefits. In Cochlear's case, its latest electrodes to improve further the hearing results for profoundly deaf people were developed together with the CRC. And by working with hearing healthcare professionals, better outcomes for babies and children have been achieved. One of my most moving experiences has been when I was at a hearing centre in Brisbane, watching as a pair of 14-month-old twins had their cochlear implants turned on. Work with the CRC has enabled hearing professionals to understand that it's important for children to be fitted with implants earlier than was previously thought, in order to deliver the best results for them throughout their lives. Sustainable tourism again falls on that spectrum between pure commercial and public good. Whilst developing products that better enable resorts and other tourism assets to improve their management of waste and energy use, they also set up spin-offs to commercialise that intellectual property and delivered the first Green Globe International Standard for Sustainable Tourism. And its founding company, EarthCheck, continues to be the world's leading scientific benchmarking, certification and advisory group for travel and tourism. They work on the premise that what can be good for the planet can also be good for business. And heading to the purely commercial end of the spectrum, the CRC for Microtechnology developed a number of devices through microengineering and manufacturing used in sectors as diverse as sport and agriculture. The one you might most recognise is the device that sits in the pocket of the jerseys of our sports people, measuring their distances, acceleration, work rate, etc. Their spin-out catapult provides wearable technologies to assist athletes to improve their performances. But those are just the few that I've personally been involved in. Other great outcomes from CRCs include 30-day contact lenses that are developed in the Vision CRC, the protective toothpaste sold as tooth mousse that you've probably seen in your dentist, developed by the Oral Health CRC. Many more successes in broader areas of mental health, mining technologies, manufacturing, photonics, agriculture, the environment. The list is enormous. And in the process of developing a CRC proposal, winning a grant, building the centre and carrying out the research and then translation of their commercialisation, there have been Australian companies who've benefited from that collaboration. Also, large multinationals which have set up here or increased their footprint, for example, Boeing. New spin-outs like Catapult, all of which have added to the Australian economy. The CRC program has returned in multiples to the investment by Commonwealth and all of those collaborative partners. So having used the CRC program as an exemplar of what science has delivered to current society, I'd like to think about the trajectory of public views towards science over the last half-century or so. In my long career as a scientist, well, that was a short bit, and then science to business translator, I've seen swings and roundabouts with respect to the view of science by the wider public. When I was a kid, the idea of a wondrous science-led future engaged us all. I grew up on cartoons like the Jetsons, Don't think so many of you are old enough to remember that. But by now we should have been whizzing around in little air cars with robot maids doing all of our dirty work. I grew up knowing that the only thing I wanted to be was a scientist. They had cool machines. They did a lot of bubbly, smelly things that went bang with coloured liquids, and they got to ask why a lot. As you can imagine, I was probably a bit of a pest as a child. We thought science would lead us into a bright new future. Air travel was becoming more affordable for all. I was also a pilot as a teenager, so like I said, gold-plated nerd. Vaccines were stopping the diseases that I had had, like measles, and even worse ones like polio that kids only a little bit older than me had had and suffered from. Household appliances we take for granted today were coming into the price range of ordinary people. Scientists were seen in adverts for everything from washing powder to toothpaste to the Pond's Institute for face cream. And even today, every cosmetic and vitamin supplement has scientific claims, real or imagined, delivered by good-looking people in white coats. I don't ever recall, as I did with a degree and then PhD in chemistry, that scientists were ever derided or treated with suspicion. Fast forward a couple of decades, and some of the anti-science rumblings were starting, whether it was the Greens despairing of the trashing of the environment, or coal miners in Britain desperately hanging on to an industry that was becoming redundant. There was a sense that this science-led world wasn't delivering the hoped-for leisured lifestyle that we were promised, we felt, and that we all desired. Again, fast forward a couple of decades, and somewhere along the line, a few people became suspicious of scientists and blamed them for all the ills of the world. Then when the internet became accessible to all, it opened a floodgate of armchair self-defined researchers who thought that random anonymous postings on Facebook or Reddit had more credibility than a scientist with years of training and peer-reviewed research. And a loud set of voices started to question the validity of science outcomes. Coupled with that, the rise of the lobbyist, often under cover of being an independent research organisation, deliberately set out to undermine the credibility of science and scientists, producing spurious facts and figures. Spinning. Examples include climate change deniers who spin hand-picked data points to prove that, and I'm quoting directly from one full-page advertisement, the real danger from any climate change will be the next ice age because we're not burning enough fossil fuel. They propose that because fossil fuels were formed from plant and animal life that absorbed CO2, then returning it to the atmosphere can do no harm. They neglect to note that oil and gas reserves were laid down over millions of years, and we're burning them in less than a century. They deny basic physics to prove their preferred worldview. And with no sense of irony, accuse scientists of driving the research and faking data to prove their point to keep their jobs. So how have things changed at all, if at all, during the COVID pandemic? I observed there's been two contrary effects. On the one hand, governments worldwide have listened to and taken note of their health scientists to frame their response to the pandemic. We hear daily the phrase, according to the health advice. Epidemiologists have become the go-to people for their views on all media, though I'm sure none of them in their wildest dreams thought that members of the general public would know so many of their names and faces. And vaccination rates in Australia are testament to the willingness of the public to listen to those with clear qualifications to offer advice. But alongside this, we have wild, angry mobs of conspiracy theorists who, in some cases, genuinely believe that vaccines are deliberately dangerous or a way of controlling us, or that Bill Gates has somehow infiltrated all levels of world government to get microchips put in vaccines. Most of us would laugh at such nonsense, but we cannot afford to be smug and discount them. They have a huge pull, and even seemingly sensible people have been sucked down those conspiracy black holes. And the effort it takes to refute any one of the articles, tweets, or other postings takes an order of magnitude more than it took the conspiracy theorists and their trolls and bots to invent it and disseminate it. And, like that suffered by journalists, the pylons are toxic and will end up frightening scientists into silence. The exact opposite of what we need right now. For example, a recent survey showed 1 in 5 Australian scientists who've spoken to the media on COVID-19 has subsequently experienced death threats and threats of violence. I just think that's appalling. But although the response can be toxic, and although scientists eschew the spotlight and really just want to get on with their research, the world has changed. And all of us who know that a better understanding of science can only help and not hinder us, just have to step up and communicate the value of what we're doing. We need to focus on the impact and benefit of not only applied research, but also so-called blue sky research, which is the bedrock upon which we build to deliver further impact down the line. And we need to persuade the general public that the scientific process delivers outcomes for their benefit. We mustn't let the keyboard warriors bully us from explaining the facts. Taking the long view, we need more emphasis on science in primary schools and upwards, so as to provide a more scientifically literate public in the future. When my son was at primary school, he was taught in his science subject that an astrologer has a scientific job and what the signs of the zodiac meant. I nearly cried. We need to be firmer in standing up to the bullying and denunciation that comes from vested interests. I know many climate scientists, for example, who privately wish that we'd been stronger years ago in communicating our messages. The very rigorous approach of science, where we talk about probabilities, and error bars, play into the hands of those who would twist that rigor to claim that climate science is inexact and we don't know what we're talking about. And that, of course, is at best. At worst, we're a whole conspiracy out to do who knows what to destroy the world economy for some nefarious, though unspecified reasons, and for whom I'm not sure either. So where to from here? My dream is to enable Australia to benefit the most from the excellent science and technology that we already have here. So what would I wish for? I have, I think, a few eminently reasonable hopes. I'd wish for more science in school, as I mentioned earlier, to educate our future company executives, investors, politicians and lawmakers. I'd wish that we do not keep letting science funding slip as a percentage of GDP. I think it should be set as a percentage to maintain. Australia sits in the middle of OECD countries with respect to the total investment in science. Wouldn't we hope to do better? And within that funding envelope, I fervently wish for continued CRC funding, as it's delivered so brilliantly on its purpose. I'd wish to encourage more people with science training into senior roles in business, parliament, etc., so that a better understanding of science permeates our society. We talk on boards of digital transformation of businesses and the need for digital literacy. Yet Australian boards have a woefully low number of directors with technology or science backgrounds. I'd wish that instead of clinging to old ways of doing things while the world moves past us, that we recognise the changing environment and get ahead of the game instead of playing catch-up, or being at risk of dwindling into insignificance. We may be very good at digging things up, but as those functions become more and more automated, they won't be providing the jobs of the future anyway. And customers for our fossil fuels will dwindle to nothing, while investment in that sector becomes increasingly unattractive to the financial markets. Energy is a great example of this. We once powered the world through our fossil fuel natural resources, and we have the ability to once again power the world, but through harnessing, converting, and exporting our abundant renewable natural resources of sun and wind. The International Monetary Fund says Australia is uniquely poised to benefit from the global shift to green energy. Even countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have recognised that reliance on fossil fuels as their key export are doomed to decrease. And so they're investing heavily in renewable energy plants and grid infrastructure investment to take that renewable energy to their markets. By 2030, Saudi Arabia plans to generate 50% of its electricity from renewables. The state-owned Aqua Power's first project under this model, a solar plant in Sudair, will be one of the largest solar PV plants in the world, with an installed capacity of 1,500 megawatts, capable of powering 185,000 homes and offsetting nearly 2.9 million tonnes of emissions each year. They're also in preparation to develop a green hydrogen facility powered by solar and wind energy. The plant will produce 660 odd tonnes per day of green hydrogen, equivalent to total global annual production today. The green hydrogen will be converted into ammonium and shipped to Asian markets such as Korea and Japan. That should be us. They are our markets. I know that Andrew Forrest spoke to the Press Club at the Press Club last week about his efforts to build green hydrogen projects on the east coast of Australia, but he needs support, and we better get our skates on, or others will have sewn up the offtakes in our markets. Australia can be, once again, a powerhouse economy, not relying on digging up things and sending them offshore, but with cheap, plentiful, renewable energy, which we will also export. We can reinvigorate our manufacturing industries in ways that rely not on unsophisticated labour, but high value add with smart materials and advanced manufacturing techniques, and there's a CRC for that too. And with cheap, plentiful energy, even heavy industry can make a comeback in green steel, green aluminium, etc. And finally, a couple of requests. I hope that everyone here stands up strongly to those who downplay the benefits of science. We only have to look at the comparisons between this pandemic and the last one nearly 100 years ago. The benefits of vaccines, of treatments with anti-inflammatories and other new jobs, equipment in our ICUs, improved public health, nursing and all other aspects of healthcare have meant that although this pandemic has been as virulent as that of 1918, the rate of deaths is approximately 1/30th compared to then. That is the beneficial result of 100 years of scientific medical research. And my final appeal is specifically to you, journalists. Don't amplify the denigrators. Balance is not one climate denier versus one climate scientist. 2,000 scientists before the denier gets their chance. One of my most cranky moments was after being invited to participate on Q&A on the annual Science edition. I was ditched at the last minute for a vociferous climate denier. Apart from missing out on the chance to hang out in the green room with my hero Brian Cox, be still my beating heart, unforgivable, I was infuriated that they would disrespect their guest scientists so much as to put up someone who denies everything that science has achieved on a science-based show just for controversy. By contrast, the Science edition last month was just scientists, and it was a fantastic discussion. So let's recognise the benefits that science has brought humanity, and let's all work together to ensure that they continue to deliver an Australia in the second half of this century that we will want to live in, and to hand on to the custodianship of our grandchildren. Excuse me, my grandchildren are out there. Ralph Slatyer was an avid believer in the potential of Australia and the role of science to achieve that. Science must be a part of the solution to get us there. And so to finish on a quote from one of my favourite philosophers, Tim Minchin, Science is not a body of knowledge, nor a system of belief. It's just a term which describes humankind's incremental acquisition of understanding through observation. Science is awesome.
Dr. Woodthorpe, thank you for that truly excellent address. I think our audience and those viewing at home and online will have found that most illuminating, and it was a very comprehensive and cogent, I think, dismissal of some of the nonsense that's been flowing around in this country. And you did mention, for example, the rioters or protesters or whatever they have been. I think we all have to acknowledge that has occurred, but it's also worth pointing out always that this represents a very small minority of the population. there are so many questions that come from that, and we will take some questions from our assembled journalists and a few from those who aren't in the room as well. But I'll just perhaps address a few of them with you first. And let me begin by making the observation that I absolutely love the fact that Australia's first satellite was bar fridge sized. That's perfect. Can we start with a general observation about the situation? You mentioned Ralph Slatyer was appointed to the position that he held by Malcolm Fraser, and then he stayed on in that position under Bob Hawke. And I've been talking to Barry Jones this morning, who was, of course, Science Minister through that period as well, certainly in the Hawke period, that is, who, by the way, has texted me during your address to say she's very good, please congratulate her for me. So,
thank you.
but I'm just wondering, what has happened to science since then, really? I mean, you've sort of covered this to some extent in your address, but back then science was seen in quite glowing terms, and you referenced a few pop culture points like the Jetsons, but if I think of shows like, you know, from the 70s and things like Lost in Space, Gilligan's Island, there was a kind of a science or an inventor type character, someone who understood physics, you know, these sorts of things, very much sort of part of that. And of course, Back to the Future, you had the Doc and all that. Science was very much inculcated into our culture then, but it does feel like it's a more contested space now. I wonder how you can explain that.
I wish I could. So I'm going to answer your first question with that. I really don't know it completely, but I think it's this ability through our modern mechanisms, social media and the like, to amplify things that once upon a time were maybe always there, but they were so small, they didn't have an audience reach of any kind, and so they withered on the vine. Whereas now, any of those sort of shoots of angst and anger get amplified. People who are susceptible to that, because, you know, the world is a worrying place in many respects, maybe a more worrying place than it was in the 60s, where maybe apart from the Cold War, we had a lot more optimism, I feel. And so it plays to those who are anxious, and because of this ability to amplify stuff, it just takes off in a way that it simply wouldn't have had the opportunity to in the past.
Yes, if you didn't know something back in those days, you either continued not to know it for a good deal of time, or perhaps you found it in an encyclopedia.
You might have gone to the library and that would have been it.
Whereas now you can do your own research, which is an entreaty that sometimes leads to some wrong outcomes. And of course you can meet other people who have an alternative view or who are subscribed to alternative facts. And so I suppose that's a process. So with the kind of democratisation of knowledge and research also comes a level of dysfunction.
Yes, I think that's very true. And this sense of research, I mean, there are any number of excellent cartoons around of, you know, the guy hunched over his computer calling to his wife going, honey, I've found something that 1 million scientists missed. But they do, and they can, and, you know, the next thing they're in Melbourne tearing down hoardings because they're so angry about something. So I think it's that combination of the reach, but also bit of a general pessimism that I think our world has at the moment that feeds into that because people are anxious. This seems to fulfill that anxiety of, I knew there was something I should have worried about, and off it takes, like setting a light to a fire.
Do you think expertise has had its moment, has had a moment, I don't mean its moment hopefully, but has had a moment, it's come back? I mean, you referenced all of the epidemiologists that we've become conversant with on our televisions. As you say, governments pretty much from day one were kind of, I won't say hiding behind, but very clear about standing behind medical expertise. The best medical advice is that we do this, that we do that. Of course, everyone can see the contrast between that and climate change, where, and one, I guess you'd say one problem was urgent and pressing, to wit the coronavirus, and the other is this kind of long-term thing. So that's part of it. But does this give you any hope that science really has had a chance to show its utility?
I do hope so, and I certainly hope that it feeds into the climate space. That sense that, oh, okay, scientists do know what they're talking about. Maybe my experts are actually worth listening to rather than someone else's opinions. So I think it's been very beneficial to raising the profile of science, in this case in the pandemic, of saving lives. It's also maybe given some of the benefit of the understanding the nuance that not all scientists, especially in something like the medical area, agree exactly precisely. They all agree in a direction, and there's nuances around the edges. And I think maybe we're slightly more sophisticated at saying, well, that's okay, because nothing is exact. And if we all agree on the premise, but some of the edges are slightly different, we can live with that, whereas before absolutism was everything. So I'm hoping that that's helped.
That's true. The sort of anti-climate change movement has really operated in that area of doubt, has really magnified any suggestion of there being any uncertainty or disagreement over projections or whatever to pretty much dismantle the whole argument, or at least that's been their approach.
I think the critical thing there is that the projections, to my mind, what terrifies me most is that, as I mentioned, we have error bars. It could be between here and here, and that has been something that's gone for some time. But over the time, we've now seen that within those error bars, we've always been at the top. So the range has always been, if anything, conservative compared to the outcome, and we've been doing this for long enough now to see clear trends.
How do you, this is sort of an unfair question in a sense, because it's not your actual area of specialty, and also it's an attempt to draw you out on make a historical judgment about something that is contemporaneous. But what's your suspicion about how this moment will be viewed in the longer term? That is the arrival of SARS-CoV-2, and within a relatively short period of time, the discovery and testing and dissemination of a whole series of quite effective vaccines. This is really sort of concertinaed process, and as you said, it's resulted in quite outstandingly lower mortality rates and morbidity rates across the world.
Maybe I could just start by actually changing some of that nuance, because it hasn't been that fast. Most of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines have been premised on work that was done for MERS and for SARS, SARS-1 or what, I can't remember exactly what it's called. But that work and the mRNA vaccines has been going on for a decade or more. It's just that at that moment, it was at a fairly stable position where we could actually turn it into a vaccine for this new variant that had appeared, SARS-CoV-2.
And what was the difference, money or urgency?
Well, from there on, it was money and urgency. Urgency leads to money. They go together. Without the urgency, the money wouldn't have flowed.
Yeah.
And the money, what it did was, well, there were two parts. One was, yes, the money really throwing everything at it meant that you could do a lot more in parallel that would have previously had to have been done in sequence, which takes so much longer. So that concentrated everything in a time frame. But also, so many people were sick that we had cohorts to recruit into clinical trials, which again normally take months, if not years, to recruit candidates into a clinical trial.
Did that change the risk profile as well? I mean, when you've got people dying, it suddenly changes the risks you're prepared to take in clinical trials, does it not?
No, it really didn't need to, I don't think, because we take all of that into account in clinical trials anyway. It just was the sheer numbers of people that were available for clinical trials where...
There was some contemporaneously going on, though, weren't there? There was stage 1 and stage 2 sort of overlapping and these sorts of things.
Yeah, so it was more a matter of numbers and money than it was about trying to in any way shortcut anything or change our risk acceptance at any stage of that process. So,
yeah, well, I certainly wouldn't want to be seen suggesting that there was unreasonable risk taken. I think that clearly there weren't.
But more people, when a lot of people are dying around you, I'll put my hand up for a clinical trial that I might not have done in the absence of any sort of urgency.
Yeah. Speaking of money, what do you make of News Corp's sort of conversion recently? Was that a function simply of money, or is it or has science played a role there? Because science wasn't making much of an impression on the company.
I wish I knew. I can't answer that question. You'll have to ask them. I'm delighted, that's for sure. It's something that, for a long time we've been very concerned that the major media reach of such an enormous organisation, not only in Australia but around the world, has been so anti-climate science. And so I'm delighted to see a change of stance. What drove it? I wish I knew.
Just a final one on money. You were talking about Twiggy Forrest and the enormous plans that he has on the East Coast. Boris Johnson, Conservative PM in Britain, spoke to investors overnight, our time, or yesterday. He at one stage said that the people in the room represented something like £24 trillion of potential investment, as he was announcing, I think, a £10 billion private fund. This is in the climate change space. Is there a danger, because I think this is what you were touching on in your comment about it, is there a danger that Australia is just too low energy about this, and that these conversions that other governments are making around the world, you mentioned a couple even in the Middle East, for example, where they've got rich on selling fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Is there a danger that all that capital is going to go elsewhere?
There is, and that capital has made that very clear to us. They haven't bandied their words in explaining what they're looking for in terms of future investments and how they're going to manage their current portfolios. The Investor Group on Climate Change has made that very clear. They're part of an international group as well, so the message has been very clear from investors about the direction that they want to put their money. And we're at such an inflection point. As the IMF said, Australia has this huge opportunity, but a huge risk associated with it. And if we don't get the opportunity and go for it, we will be left behind.
Question from Misha Schubert, my fellow board member and fellow vice president of the Press Club.
Indeed. Here today as a board member and VP of the club, but also in my day job, CEO of Science and Technology Australia. Dr. Woodthorpe, thanks for your address. A question inviting you to sort of channel your previous roles as Queen of Fire and Ice, because in both of those roles, you were looking at two of the key areas in which those global indicators around the changing climate are at their most acute, perhaps. So, two questions, if I may. When you look at that body of scientific evidence and those increasingly clear pictures that are emerging from that you just described, what does that tell us about what we need to do as a global community in the years and decades ahead? And if you had an ability to directly speak to the parliamentarians who are considering these issues through the course of this week, what would your message be to them?
Thank you. So my message to anyone that's listening, parliamentarians, lawyers, scientists, we don't have time to keep putting this off. We have a budget, if you like, for carbon dioxide. If we use a certain amount of carbon dioxide, pump it into the atmosphere, that will lead inexorably to a certain level of global warming. That carbon budget has been determined by years and years of modelling and refined and refined and refined. Every bit of carbon we use today is one less we can use next decade and the decade further. So the quicker we bring our carbon use down, the longer all of it can take to transition. But if we don't do something urgently, we will regret it when 20 years down the track we either say, well, we're facing much higher global warming issues, or we have to drop off a cliff in terms of our carbon usage. So the more we can do now, the less we do further on. It just stretches the whole process out much more equitably for everybody. But it's urgent. For decades, 28 years, the Antarctic CRC has been talking about it. I chaired it for 18 years. For 18 years, we've been talking about this, and it really is the time for every single person to do whatever action they can at an individual level, but support those who do it at higher levels of governance as well. All of that's critical.
Ahead of Glasgow, or going into Glasgow, Joe Biden is reportedly taking 13 cabinet ministers and other officials, among them Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, obviously Antony Blinken, the Foreign Secretary. It's a real, the whole point of that is a real show of force, a gesture of commitment in relation to this. These are the kinds of gestures being made. In Australia, we've had equivocation about even attending, let alone going there with any sort of pledge. What does that say?
I don't know what it says, but I know what I'd like to see. I'd like to see us go in force, not least to learn in a very direct way what everyone else is doing and how they can go about it, because none of it is easy. You know, I don't pretend for a second it is, but it's very real and we've got to do it. So the more we can share with other people to learn how they can offer advice, how we can do it better in order to take some of the sting out of the transition that is inevitable, the better. So I would love to see us take a show of strong and influential people over there.
Now we have a question from online. Is that correct? Yes.
This question comes from Julie Hare, Education Editor of the Australian Financial Review. The Australian government has said it will address climate change via technology, not taxes. Can you speak to whether the framework for research and development in Australia is up to scratch to achieve significant reductions in carbon via technology? And if not, what needs to happen?
Thanks for that question. My worry with this mantra of technology is that it's a bit of a cop-out, to be frank. Technology is going to be incredibly important. It's a really big part of the picture. But we can't rely on it solely. We can't rely on carbon capture, taking all the carbon we need to get out of the atmosphere, because it isn't being shown to work yet. We can't rely on any of the technologies that we need because there's not time for them to be up and proven in time. We need to change behaviours at a personal level and at an industry level and at a community level ASAP. So technology is going to be a critical part of it. Solar panels and their increased efficiency, solar concentrating thermal, which is coming along now, pumped hydro, all of these issues or components of technology are incredibly important, but we can't rely solely on them. We also have to have behavioural change at the same time.
Is the government to some extent vindicated by what appears to be overperformance against the Paris targets based largely on these sorts of technological changes, or is this actually the function of all of the states actually signing up to what the Commonwealth refuses to sign up to, which is net zero by 2050 and other measures?
I think it's a mixture of things. Whether we've outperformed our Paris targets again is something that will be great if at the time it's found to be true, but we're not there yet. We're not at the target end yet, and until we see that, I'm not going to comment there. But certainly the states have been proactive in getting ahead of the program, and so have communities. I live in a council area in Sydney, Lane Cove, which has also got ahead of the game and is taking climate action already. So I think, you know, it filters down to everyone. We can't assume that the Commonwealth Government are the only people who have any responsibility here. We all do as individuals. And although what they do influences everything else incredibly importantly, I can't absolve everybody else from getting on with it as well. So it's just absolutely important that we all do our bit.
Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times.
One of the big demands is that science has got to be applied. We've got to be able to see the product of the science once rather than just having the people in the researching in lab coats. Do you think that CRCs have actually provided a big opportunity to get away from that? There must be research that's actionable, or producing a product, and instead is actionable in a broader sense because it's providing openings and understandings that wouldn't be otherwise available. Do you think that we need, and that we, for example, have seen the cybersecurity CRC, that's provided us with a great deal of information and a new way of looking at cybersecurity. Do you think we need other areas in particular that you would like to see prioritised by the government for such scientific research? And the other thing is, you're a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. The AICD has said, oh, we need a lawyer on every board. We need a accountant on every board. Would you like to say we actually need a scientist on every board?
Well, I'm going to start at the end of your set of questions and go, yes. And I've been banging that drum at the AICD for a very long time. And I think I referenced it slightly in in the comments I made earlier, because, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, not least because scientists ask why. So it's not just that they bring an understanding of science and, you know, whether it's digital technology or whatever, but they bring a process and an approach that I find around a board table incredibly useful, because you don't just say, oh, you know, I read these board papers, they're all good. You go, but why are we doing this? I don't just need to know how, I want to know why, and that's the scientist. So I think they're incredibly valuable. And I saw a program the other evening on Angela Merkel, and one of the things they talked about, one of her great specialties, was asking why and how and should we. And just that questioning scientific mind was something that was unique at the time. Nobody had seen someone like her in German politics. So I found that fascinating, and only a couple of nights ago. In terms of picking what areas CRCs should be, the key to CRCs has always been that it's driven by the users. So it really needs to be where groups come together, the academics, but most importantly the users, to drive what they see as the next most important areas. The government obviously then has a set of parameters around which those proposals are judged. But I think the way the system works actually lets the important things bubble to the surface, as it has with the cybersecurity one, as it has in the past with photonics, as it has clearly with bushfires and natural hazards. So I'm very comfortable that the mechanisms around it at the moment actually are working to deliver the really big ticket problems and ideas that we need to be tackling. And then just back to the beginning of your questions about blue sky research, no applied research can be done without blue sky research. It's the bedrock, as I said. It's the bit upon which you can't do photonics without the physics. We can't do the modelling in bushfires without the physics, the meteorology, and the data handling. All of those basic sciences lead to the opportunity we have to do something that's right at the very functional end. So it's a portfolio. We always need to do all of them, and finding that balance is always the tricky bit.
Question from Michael Keating.
Michael Keating, Keating Media. You've mentioned how CRCs have commercialised their research and returned much more on their initial investment. Another area is, of course, Australian universities, which it seems have been relatively recent to entrance in commercialising their research and getting a return on investment. How do you rate Australian universities in commercialising their research, and how do you think they can improve in the future?
Thanks. That's an interesting question. I think one of the problems we have is actually understanding what universities are there for. I can see my colleague Belinda over there nodding away. You know, they're there to educate. In terms of the research area, they're there to grow the next generation of scientists and researchers in whatever field, in the arts or the humanities. And then they're there to do the research and to some extent commercialise it. But the CRCs themselves have shown that working together with the universities delivers that outcome in a really good way. I think we also, and maybe it's something we're really good at in Australia, is kind of beating ourselves up sometimes, saying we don't do stuff well. But if you look at the US and their plethora of universities, there's like 4 that make a buck out of commercialisation in any serious way. So I think that we are doing as well as I think we could probably like to. We could do better. We could learn to do better. But it's never as simple as we should just commercialise more widgets. I'm also in favour of, there's a lot, I think UNSW has a much more open source approach to a lot of their intellectual property. So they don't necessarily see a lot of money from it, but the opportunity that that creates for others to take it and turn it into a thing, a process, a service, then delivers an economic benefit overall, and we mustn't discount that part of it as well.
A question, I believe, from Tim Shaw that Morris is going to read out, correct?
Thank you, Mark. Tim Shaw, one of our directors, has sent this question in for you. Astronaut Neil Armstrong took that first step on the surface of the moon in 1969 and declared that's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. 50 years on from that government-funded leap of science, billionaires like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk and Dr. Andrew Forrest are using it and turning science into profit. Is that the future? Should government get in or get out of the way?
So first, I'd like to separate Dr. Andrew Forrest out from the others, because I think where Andrew Forrest is putting both his money and his energy, and he even went out and got himself a PhD by working really hard in marine science, I think that he has a more holistic view. I think there's this other, it's been described as sort of the billionaires club jumping into space, and there's a degree of that that I find problematic, that they're not adding to the science necessarily. I think Elon Musk has, but I'm not convinced that the others who seem to be doing it more for a party in space than anything else are adding in the same way. So I think that there is always a place for government, especially when you want to make those huge visionary leaps, just as JFK did with the US space program back in the early to mid-60s.
And that was about targets, by the way, wasn't it?
We will be there by 70.
Yeah.
Before this decade is out, we will be there. And having a target just really sharpens the mind and gets you there. But they, of course, then we all know about all the other things that leapfrogged because of the investment. And I think we forget that those sorts of investments have tangible benefits in a much wider area than the initial investment was made. So I think governments have a huge role and are doing a lot. They invest in, from the NH and MRC to the ARC to universities and so forth. They're investing huge amounts, and they do it very well on the whole.
We have another question from John Ross online.
Okay. Hannah?
Thank you. This question is from John Ross, Asia Pacific editor from Times Higher Education. Why do you think criticism of scientists has become so vitriolic and personal during the COVID crisis? What dark underbelly of the Australian and global psyche has COVID managed to unleash, more than other controversial subjects on which scientists also advocate, for example, climate change or land clearing regulations?
That's really interesting, and it sort of follows on from what we talked about earlier, Mark. It's, I think, based in that fear and anxiety that COVID has brought about with people, that this sudden scary thing is upon us. People are dying all over, certainly the world and even in Australia at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think that then feeds on any concerns they have. Whereas climate change, people like me are dead scared and extraordinarily anxious about it, but it doesn't fit the ordinary person in the street. It doesn't impact them really directly and really tangibly. So I don't think it feeds their anxieties in the same way as COVID has. And so when you mix fear and anxiety with drops of vitriol that are coming from places where, as I said, they wouldn't have had an audience once upon a time, I think that's the dangerous mixture that's then just bubbled over into this awful mess. But I think the core of it all is just this fear that people have when the pandemic took off last year. And there are some deliberately malicious people who feed that fear and feed those drops of vitriol into what is obviously a very labile mix, to use a scientific term.
Astrid Watts.
Hi Catherine, thank you so much for your talk and including the information on disability CRCs that are going on. My question relates to that. Where do you see the future of CRCs as far as the future development for people with chronic illnesses or disabilities to succeed?
Thanks, Astrid. As you point out, yes, I didn't necessarily name all of them, but certainly ones like the Autism CRC have had amazing results in their management of autism in children in particular, and how to help those children. Mental health more broadly, the Young and Well CRC, there's been a number of them. So I think it's like everything in CRC land, it is a really great opportunity to bring together the researchers with the users to actually deliver an outcome that's practical and that can be used and that is used. I have a granddaughter who's on the autism spectrum, and I know there are programs that she is engaged with that actually came out of the CRC. So I think there's a great opportunity for CRCs to be that particular area of collaborative research very effectively.
Just before we go to Morris, a quick couple of questions, sort of two-parter, I suppose. Should science communication be taught in schools, do you think, to really kind of increase the literacy, the ability to explain scientific concepts and process? And would that go some way to addressing another problem, which is the underrepresentation of women in STEM?
I'll address that last one last. Science communication is incredibly important. I think all scientists should do a course in science communication. One of the most useful courses I did as an undergrad was actually sales and marketing. I was at UMIST, which is a part of Manchester University, and we were all obliged to take one commercial course. And I did sales and marketing, and you know, I ended up in sales and marketing because I just realized that it gave me a great voice. And I think science communication is the same. It's that having that voice. In these days when money is tight, being able to explain your science
and persuade,
and why it's really important and why you should be funded to do that thing is incredibly important, and not least to the taxpayers whose money we're using. I think there was almost a golden era back in, say, the 40s or 50s, really, maybe 60s, where scientists could get money by going, I'm really good, I'm really clever, and I'm really good at this, and I find it really interesting, so can you fund me? And they did. That doesn't wash today. Taxpayers, governments, there are so many more calls on the taxpayer dollar. Scientists now need to explain why it matters what they do and why what they're going to do will deliver something that matters. And I don't necessarily mean just applied science. That's also in astronomy or other areas. But in terms, remind me of the second half.
Women in STEM?
Women in STEM. So there is not a dearth of women in STEM. There's a dearth of women who are encouraged, enabled, and don't have barriers put against them to rise in STEM. At the bottom end of that pipeline, there are, if I recall correctly, it's kind of getting 50-50-ish. Even in my day, it was 30%, and that's going back an awful long time. But it's the next bit of the pipeline that's the problem. It's the women getting through, whether it's taking advantage of having to have maternity leave and then finding that their careers have taken a step backwards, whether the barriers against them in all sorts of other areas are put up such that, and it's exactly the same in business, you know. It doesn't really change whether you're talking about the 2 or 3 or whatever the number is of ASX 200 CEOs that are women. The pipeline is huge at the bottom, but we just keep cutting them out all the way up so that when you get to the top...
And then history cuts them out as well. I mean, we don't talk about Rosalind Franklin, we talk about Crick and Watson.
100% right. And we don't talk about any number of women scientists. You know, Marie Curie and others might be names that people go, oh yeah, did she do something? But no, especially Rosalind Franklin, though she couldn't have got a Nobel Prize winner, she was dead. I'm really sorry.
That does tend to exclude you.
Yes. But she has been written out of history by and large, absolutely.
Absolutely, yes. Final question from Mrs. Schubert.
Just a quick last one. You've referenced the sort of really important work of diversity in bringing different diverse perspectives to innovation and board thinking. And in the context of your role on the board around the CRC natural hazards and bushfires one, there's been a big movement of Indigenous cultural burning practitioners and leaders across the country. Really exciting work happening there. Could you maybe update us on what the plans are to bring Indigenous cultural burning expertise into the work and the governance of that CRC?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of our research program going forward, we have a huge part on Indigenous and cultural burning in there. And that research program has been gathered through, I think it's about 8 workshops around the country with a range of scientists and users, everything from, you know, rangers to firefighters to flood people, all of the rest, to put that research program together. And there's a really heavy component on Indigenous and cultural burning. So first of all, it's something we take really seriously at the research level. In terms of management and governance particularly, we went to market in a normal way with ads. We also reached out to a number of Indigenous scientists in the governance space to see if they were interested to join us, and at this stage they weren't, but it's something that's constantly on my agenda as we continue to refresh the board, because I do want to increase that diversity, but there's only so much you can do to ask people. And to be frank, most of those Indigenous people at that sort of level are so overworked, and a couple of them have said to me, I just can't take on any more. I'm already stretched. So again, it's back to that pipeline. We need to grow more people of every area of diversity through from the bottom upwards, so that we actually have more people at the top who can share what is quite a heavy workload.
Dr. Katherine Woodthorpe, it's been absolutely terrific having you here at this historic event, really, our first physical press club event since the lockdown. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking Katherine?
Thank you. Thank you.